and welcome back everyone to this week 2 overview here in your cultural anthropology class. Hopefully at this point now you have a bit of a sense of what cultural anthropology entails. In our first week we talked very generally about anthropology and we stressed some of the values that we often talk about, including trying to refrain from being ethnocentric and focusing on what we call cultural relativism. We also discussed how cultural relativism has limits, and one of the nuanced things in this class is really talking about things like cultural relativism and situations where we can and we cannot apply it in the example of human rights violations that we unfortunately see at this time around the world. As we get into week 2, we'll continue with some themes here, and it's a reminder as we talked about cultural relativism of how challenging the social sciences are generally, and more specifically how cultural anthropology is super challenging. So when we start to talk about culture, we're really getting into something that has a lot of nuance and some definite gray areas. I want to just remind you that if you're following along with the class, to be sure that you go to the modules pages and that you just carefully make sure that everything that is assigned or due that week, that you complete that. And again, try to follow this order because it really makes some sense if you just go through this. Clicking first on the learning objectives for chapter 2, so you see we're going to get into some continued discussions of cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, talk a little bit about fieldwork technique, and discuss aspects of culture in anthropology. This will show you again the reading for the week, and you can always click on that, and then this very easily takes you to the textbook. So you can see the main concept this week is talking about the idea of culture. So as far as the themes this week, we'll look at 3. So the book very closely talks about culture. Connected to that, I wanted to talk about the issue of cultural appropriation because I think it's one of those key ones that we often identify when we see the world of fashion, pop culture, movies, even hairstyles can often relate to forms of cultural appropriation. And another big one out there is food. I think food is one that we want to really think about in terms of how it speaks to these issues of inappropriately taking one culture and its folklore, if you will, and then appropriating it for your own, often for the purpose of selling something, for marketing something in pop culture. And then I'll also talk about my research. Even though we're getting into research next week, I definitely want to give you a sense of just what professional cultural anthropologists do, the kind of research that some of us are engaged in, and so forth. Now, one of the sections that I think is pretty interesting in the textbook is this discussion of the anthropologist as a storyteller. And they start off by talking about how throughout history, human cultures have relied on stories. In fact, storytelling and art and aesthetics, what we call expressive culture often in anthropology, could be called one of the real human conditions that distinguishes us from other animals and particularly from the other primates. Now, they also talk about early on, there was a lot of what we call armchair anthropology. So literally, these folks were studying culture from a distance. They sometimes are reading the documents of missionaries and then writing about those cultures. The problem with secondhand information, if you ever played like the telephone game where you go in a circle, we used to do this as part of some of our trainings at the theme park I worked at for employees, employee trainings, and you would tell a story in someone's ear, and then it would go around, and by the time it got to like 30 people, you would lose a lot of the details. So one of the interesting things about storytelling in anthropology is that we know if we have more direct first-hand experiences with a culture, not that we have a better perspective. Perspectives are always biased, as we'll talk about later in this lecture, but it maybe has a little more reliability than working from the armchair. If someone gives you their notes from a trip, very detailed notes, let's say a travel log, we talked last week about travel logs and the grand tours and so forth, you could reconstruct aspects of that trip, but you weren't there to see the sights, the sounds, the smells, to experience all those senses that you would get if you were actually there in the field. So the key to storytelling in anthropology, when we write what we call ethnographies, which are written descriptions of other cultures, it comes from the word ethnos, which means ethnic group or group of people, and graphy, which is a system of representation. So an ethnography is a written description of another culture that takes place after the anthropologist has lived in that culture for an extended period of time of what we call fieldwork or participant observation. So bringing up storytelling, I think, is really cool at this section in the class, and also thinking about some of those early tendencies that predated the anthropology that we do today. So if you get a chance to look at the book, you'll go to chapter 2, and this section I called out for in particular is really good. We'll get back to some of this. This is a section on the storyteller on 32. So this has some of the early anthropologists, including the work of E.B. Tyler, his work, Primitive Culture, one of the earliest books of anthropology. Also talks a little bit about Charles Darwin. And then we get into this idea of anthropologists being cultural participants. So before the era of participant observation, we had more of that armchair anthropology going on. And it was certainly, again, an opportunity to think about doing fieldwork in a setting that allowed for what we call today participant observation. So the Polish anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who did work in the Trobriand Islands, was very famous then for, and this is one of his shots in a field setting which has a real colonialist kind of look to it. He actually was often accused just of some of his tendencies. Interesting story about Malinowski is after he wrote his famous book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, 1922, amongst the Trobriand Islanders, many years after this, there was a publication called A Diary in the Strict Sense of the Term published after Malinowski died, so it wasn't authorized. And when people read it, they were really surprised because some of the things he said in the diary were shocking, incredibly offensive. And there's actually a debate. I remember taking graduate seminars in anthropology where people said, was this ethical to publish what was a private diary after the fact? Yes, it gave you insights about Malinowski's inner thoughts, many of which were disturbing. But ethically, as we'll talk about ethics next week in week 3 of the class, should we have published, should the community, whoever had the rights to this book, this diary, should they have published it or not? So I think it raises some interesting ethical questions. Again, Malinowski said, you travel to the location, you live among the people, you learn their language, and you take detailed field notes. So you would have a field journal, and you would take notes, very detailed notes. In today's day and age, as we'll talk about with my research, it's often audio-visual stuff that you're doing, particularly with cell phones. You can take some amazing footage, photography, still photography, video, of course, and audio. So nowadays, if you're thinking about getting into Anthro and doing field work, I don't want to say it'll be easier, but your technological needs and concerns are much easier than they were years ago. Even when I was an undergraduate and thinking about doing some of this and thinking about specifically how do I record interviews with people in my field settings. So let me jump back to the PowerPoint here. So check out the types of research and what we mean by participant observation. That'll be a real key. Next, I'd like you to look on page 35 and specifically look at the theories of culture. So you get a nice comparison here of some of the theories, including what the British did called functionalism and structural functionalism, looking at society as made up of different parts. And functionalists, whether in sociology or anthropology, believe that just like the body has systems that regulate ourselves, we have circulatory system, nervous system, all the organs of the body, society has similar organs. And so a functionalist believes that the various functions in society, the various institutions, serve key purposes, notably to prevent entropy or loss or, say, a lack of cohesion from happening in a society. So you can also look then at the United States, and in particular, we're coming back here to this important concept of cultural relativism associated with Franz Boas, known as the father of American anthropology. He was really revolutionary for his work, founded the first academic department at Columbia University in New York, and did so much to combat anti-Semitism and racism in anthropology. In fact, he was censored by the American Anthropological Association because of political reasons, and years later that censure was removed by the AAA. So Boas is incredibly important. His study of the Kwakiutl, of Native American cultures, really were revolutionary. Many people connected him to this notion. He didn't call it this, but some people said he was, in contrast with functionalists, a historical particularist. So he was interested in a lot of detail, where he says we refrain from making general observations about culture and its people until we understand the unraveling of that is occurring around our eyes. Years later, anthropologists like Clifford Geertz, who founded what we call interpretive anthropology, that focuses on, to go back to stories, symbolism and meaning and interpretations of culture, almost as if culture itself was a type of text to be read and understood by the anthropologist. So you start to see, as you study more and more anthropology at the upper undergraduate level, as a junior or senior, and certainly into your master's or PhD program, you start to look at the interconnections of theories that you learn about in the discipline and also anthropologists. So you connect folks like Boas to Clifford Geertz. It's not unlike musicians, right? Great musicians who have legacy from an earlier musician often will say, well, that person was really important to me. I was just watching a documentary on Netflix on drumming, and Dave Grohl was talking about just the legacy of Keith Moon, the late great drummer from The Who. And so it's kind of the same thing in academics, where you see one thinker earlier influencing another one, in this case, kind of a legacy from Boas to Geertz. So definitely learn about Boas and his work. You also get many of his students here being discussed. Kroeber, in particular, along with Kluckholm at UC Berkeley, did a really remarkable book. They have a copy of it. I didn't bring it out with me here, but it's called Culture. And it's just a book of definitions of culture. And it's a good reminder, actually, for later when we talk about culture, about how challenging it is for anthropologists to define something that we think is a core, we know is a core aspect of our discipline. Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, very important individuals in American anthropology, did a lot of work certainly on gender in terms of work in Samoa with Mead. Also, Ruth Benedict really looking at kind of key characteristics of culture, and wrote some books during the war years, during World War II, where there was more interest in using culture to understand like key personality. We often would associate someone like Ruth Benedict with the culture and personality school or aspects of it in anthropology, which gets into psychological anthropology a little bit. And during the war, the interest was if you knew how Germans think or Japanese think, then maybe you could defeat them in the war effort. Now, just by saying that, we introduce kind of a racist or ethnocentric assumption there. And indeed, if we think about the legacy of internment camps in the United States, I mean, I think some of that thinking, not from Benedict, but more in terms of American policy, led to those tragedies. And if you ever get a chance, go down to Manzanar in Southern California and check out the incredible museum and harrowing museum there, dedicated to looking at this dark history as part of World War II. And I'm connecting that because I think there's an interesting trajectory here we're going to learn about today as we talk more about culture in Chapter 2. On the one hand, anthropologists say we want you to learn culture, and maybe we want you to apply it. What if the application of that happens to be towards an effort that has a policy situation? We'll talk about this later with the Human Terrain System project happening with anthropological embeds during the war in Afghanistan. And, we just recently pulled out of Afghanistan, so it's been in the news recently. Also in this week, we'll talk a little bit with the work of Clotaire Rapai and also Grant McCracken with the work on culturematics about taking maybe some of these tendencies that Benedict identified and saying, okay, if we understand that Americans like certain things and they think a certain way, can we apply that to something that we market to them? And the example I'll talk about was with Clotaire Rapai, who's a real controversial figure, and I wouldn't call him an anthropologist per se. He's talked about being an anthropologist, a biological anthropologist, but also a psychologist. But he was behind the development of the Hummer, which is kind of an infamous car, and I actually wrote a chapter for a book called The Hummer. So I've studied the Hummer a little bit, been to dealerships, did some research there, interviewed people, researched blogs, and wrote this short chapter for a book on the Hummer. And it's kind of an example of some of the research I'll talk about later in terms of looking at an aspect of culture, in this case an automobile and a brand, and trying to use it to understand the nuances of like Americans and how they think and how they act and how they think about consumption and even driving cars. Well, what Rapai did was to say there's this lizard-like part of the human brain, And it's the part of the human brain maybe that likes to have big things or doesn't like to think and just likes to feel. So that was kind of part of that tendency to develop the Hummer. And so my question for all of you is, are you okay with that when we get into cultural appropriation? If someone uses their knowledge of Polynesian cultures to create a tiki bar or a tiki themed space, are you okay with that? How do we debate that as students of anthropology? So the work of Benedict is really key in terms of looking at some of these issues we're going to be talking about this week. You'll note the word holism, thinking of the whole, as significant in studying culture, so you definitely want to look at that. And here we go. Here is Clifford Geertz. So we see some of that legacy talking about culture as being something that is communicated through speech and behaviors. So you're going to see there's a lot of difference in some people saying culture is something that's kind of locked inside you versus Geertz saying it's something that is more communicated through speech and behaviors. So the issue of culture, as we talk about it this week, will certainly challenge us because there's so much debate about what culture is, A, and then B. If we have a sense of what it is, like Benedict in some of her studies of culture during the World War II era, and applying that to policy, what do we think about that? Is that ethical as we get into ethics? So I'm going to jump in now. So kind of this was theme 1 was culture. Theme 2 here is my culture research. And I'll talk about this for a couple weeks. And the reason for this is I really want to give you insights about what professional anthropologists do. We don't just sit around reading intro books. And believe me, our intro book is pretty good, but it's not the most exciting or compelling stuff you'll ever read. No intro book is great. I've written one textbook in sociology, and I'll tell you, they can be super dry. So I encourage you this week and in all weeks to go to our modules and to really check out those additional readings. And those are really easy to find. So you just go back to our modules, go to the week in question. So this week it's week 2. Week 1, we don't have any additional readings. Click on additional readings, and you'll get to read some of these. Again, a lot of this deals with cultural appropriation as well as culture shock. So I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about this in your discussion post. And then you can also always check out the media. So click on week 2 media and watch a video or 2. These are the ones that I think are going to be interesting as we debate the application of culture as well as the messiness of culture. And does culture determine who we are? Is it, as Geertz and others have said, sort of the ghost behind behavior? It's the thing that drives us to do things. Or do you think culture doesn't exist? You might be a radical anarchist, vegan, musician, and you say, I don't fit into any of the norms of what I see on TV when I watch TV, if I even do, or what I see in the internet. I don't believe in my culture, so therefore I'm not really a part of it. I'm part of subculture, so maybe culture doesn't apply to me. And that's, I think, a really interesting question to address. And you'll get a little more here, including a little lecture I did on tiki culture and some research I did working with tiki aficionados back in the day in Southern California. So definitely check out the additional readings and media for every week that they are available. So let me get into my research a little bit and give you kind of some of the nuances of it. So this was a piece I wrote back way in 2009. It makes me feel kind of old. And this was field research I did, I think in, I want to say like 2005 or 6. It's ages ago. And I was deliberately like trying to stage, me standing in front of sort of like iconic sites at Epcot at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Very specifically trying to show kind of this other side of doing research. So a lot of the folks that did research in my program at Rice University did non-traditional research. So one person, for example, studied climate models created by the agency in Colorado. Another person studied dance funding and National Endowment for the Arts and its impact on dance groups. I studied my experiences working in a theme park called Six Flags Astroworld in Houston, Texas, which is no longer there, but it's a defunct Six Flags park. So I was specifically trying to show this to give you like some stereotypical field shots, but to show that I'm not in, quote, real places. These are all images from Epcot. And in fact, a lot of anthropologists would say it's offensive to even think about going to these places like theme parks because they're so known for taking culture, as we talked about McCracken's work and Rapai's work, taking it and applying it in ways that maybe some consider to be sinister because you're going to the Epcot version of France or Germany. And how ridiculous in the first place to think that you could have the essence of a country encapsulated in one theme space within a theme park. So I wanted to show these kind of to poke fun at that a little bit, and also talking here about the aspects of studying simulations of places. And I'll get to this with my paper called Culture Sampling later. But I think it's pretty interesting that there is this tendency in professional anthropology to look down upon those of us who study pop culture or study something like spaces of theme parks. Again, the program that I took part in as a PhD student at Rice was known for kind of a postmodern approach, and I'll talk about this later. And very specifically, people were interested in non-traditional field work and non-traditional field sites, and even doing what we call multi-sited field work, where you don't go to one site, you go to multiple sites to engage with your informants and your field of study. Kind of like in my work on the Hummer, where I went to a Hummer dealership and I worked with people on the internet on blogs and discussion boards that were for and against the Hummer. So it's an example of just the different types of research that you will encounter. Now, this is a situation from a specific research site, and I'll just go through these quickly, but very specifically, I was at a famous theme park or a mall, and I actually got booted out of this mall. And I'm actually going to probably go back and blur the faces of the folks in there because I didn't get their permission. But as they were approaching my camera, I have a social media site on YouTube where I post a lot of these analyses of these theme spaces just kind of for my viewers. And they just said, I couldn't film, and I was talking into my camera, and it appeared strange to them, and they basically booted me out of. They said I could stay there, but I couldn't do any photography. You're not allowed in this space, and that's one thing I think you'll encounter if you do field work in spaces of pop culture. You often think you have total access to those sites because anyone can go there. You don't need a special access like to get into even corporate places like the Tesla plant, places that have secret, corporate information. You can't just go in, and you think, well, if it's a place that is is open to the public, you would have easy access. Not always the case. In fact, I've done some videos for my YouTube site talking about the challenges of doing research in consumer spaces and some of the tricks you can use. Even if you have your own blog or social media site, if you go in a casino, I spent a lot of time in Vegas, and I just know, I'm not going to take photos or videos of the pit area. It's always areas that don't have gaming operations, because the concern about cheats and hustlers who are going to come in and steal from casinos, which has happened numerous times throughout the world, makes it that nobody wants to have their operations filmed such that someone could use that to figure out how to cheat the casinos. So it's just a little reminder there. If you're doing research in a Vegas casino, you'll never get hassled if you're in the Venetian and you're taking videos or still images of all the sites of the theming and the canals and stuff. It's just if you get into the gaming areas or the cash box, the booth there with the cashier and stuff, security, you just don't want to film that kind of stuff. Now, early on in my research, again, I was a trainer. Here's my name tag from Six Flags Astroworld, and I did training of employees. I worked rides. I trained people on the rides. I trained people on guest friendliness, on working, in situations that were often super stressful. And then this became the subject of my dissertation. So I wrote about management culture. It wasn't a lot about the research that I do today, which is more on theming and the design of spaces, but it was more on how exactly could we understand the management culture of this theme park in Houston, Texas. And so when you do your PhD in anthropology or any field, you write what's called a dissertation. So the dissertation represents your completed work, your research. This is my dissertation. It just topped in at 543 pages, and it's kind of like small print. But when you read through it, it really talks about not just this theme park, but visiting other theme parks and trying to understand the theme park industry. Like anything else, you have extensive references, you have a bibliography, you have a thesis, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what a dissertation looks like. And I bought a copy from University of Michigan. They kind of archive all the dissertations. This one's called Signal 3. And it is the name for a radio code that goes out if there's a extreme emergency in a theme park, including a death. And kind of the framing incident in the dissertation is a death of a maintenance worker that occurred at Astroworld right after I had left, and I knew some of the folks who had sent out, unfortunately, the roller coaster that killed this maintenance worker, whom I did not know. And I very recently actually wrote about this in a chapter for a friend's book on theme park rides, trying to talk about death and its avoidance in theme parks. And indeed, a lot of the experiences I had at Astroworld working there, like any of you working in service industry, it's the day-to-day mundane stuff. It's helping people out. It's trying to make sure that when, a guest is really upset or pissed off at you or someone else, you calm them down, you use some social judo. I have so much respect working and training folks in the service industry, and I can tell you horror stories working with guests. I have horror stories when I would volunteer cleaning bathrooms during like Reba McEntire concerts, Selena concerts, the late Selena. We had some great concerts at Astroworld, and some of us that worked more in management or training would volunteer. And it was a good experience because you got to see, like, doing custodial work. You just got to interact with people in like what Mike Rowe calls dirty jobs, literally and figuratively, but also just kind of interacting with people when they're drunk, when they're not behaving their best. And any of you that have worked in casinos or local restaurants in the service industry, I say, you're some of the best workers out there because your social skills and your needs to diffuse people when they're upset with you are so valuable. And if you ever work in service, you can really take some of those soft skills and apply them later in life. I use them all the time. I don't always diffuse tense social situations the best, but I like to think that some of my experiences working at Astroworld, writing about them, training people have helped me now in the present. So these are just some of the documents you see. So when anthropologists go to field sites, they talk to people. In my case, I was directly experiencing on a day-to-day basis what I was doing, and so I took detailed field notes. And I also had a lot of documents like these, which were our employee handbooks, you could see from 95, ride training manuals, and these are the aspects of material culture that you often collect as an anthropologist as part of your archive. This could also include videos, audio stuff. I have hundreds of photographs and videos from my various experiences at Astroworld or, to this day, other theme parks. In fact, if you go to my Google photo site, it's something like 60 or 70,000 photos, which sounds crazy, but I literally use them all the time. So if I need an image of me like here at the Moroccan Bazaar at Epcot among the tourists, I can just look for that. I have them organized fairly carefully. And let me just show you that because I think it's something that you might be interested in as we get into the kind of contemporary version of what anthropologists do. And I'll talk a little more about this next week as well, but I'm really trying to emphasize as much as I can the focus on research. So when I go to my site, I might have, I might have a folder that has generic images of theming from around the world. If it's stuff like the old Fry's store, which I know is, I think they've gone into bankruptcy. I think Fry's is no more. But anytime I go to a space, I might have images of those spaces. And in this case, these are just kind of random collected images of different spaces. I also have very more specific such images. Example, this would be, say, the Venetian in Vegas. So I can very quickly go to all my photos of the Venetian, and if I want to, then I have these available for research, or if I need an image for a publication or something like that. And they're not tagged, but you could certainly do meta tags in today's day and age and really have effective organization of all your photos. And the same goes to all my videos. I have literally thousands of videos on my YouTube site, and I have many more videos that I haven't put up there. They're just like the still that are just kind of raw footage that I haven't used. So it's an aspect of doing this kind of research today is just like that shift to not just having field notebooks, but also having video and audio documentation of the sites that you study. Now, after I did this dissertation, I did my first collection, which was called The Theme Space, and this was back in, I don't even remember, 2007, I feel old, but this is a collection focusing on just theming in different spaces around the world. Theming is like what you see at the Venetian, so it's taking a place, what I call a sample of culture, and then applying that to a design scheme. Like here on the screen you see Morocco as an example at Epcot. So this book was a collection. And edited collections mean you have a series of authors who contribute. I did an extensive call for participants or call for papers, and then people submitted work, and I did all the editing. I did all the layout of it. I did the index, the bibliography. It's a ton of work, and I kind of joke with people. In fact, right here, I have a check. Let's see, it's an old check from, I don't know if it's bad to show check numbers on the internet. It might be bad. I have no idea. Let me cover that up. But in any case, this is from it's from this book and a second book I did on film remakes, also an edited collection. And this was last year, and the grand total for royalties for 1 year, this is 2020, is $65.75. Okay, so and this is after well over 500 of each copies have sold. I should say I just got a check for this year a couple days ago for both books. It was like $147. So it's not terrible. You know, you write 2 books, and if every year you get $100, 10 years later you have $1,000. But I mean, you're not doing any of this to make money. Just to let you know, because I think a lot of people think you write books and you make a ton of money. You don't necessarily make a lot of money. So this particular book was really taking my research that I showed you with the dissertation and expanding on it. This is something I often show you in the face-to-face version of this class, how different ethnography and fieldwork that you do can speak to different issues: participant observation, field informants, the voice, which is the style that you write your ethnography in for your audience. The field site, is it a multiple field site? Is it one field site? The perspective of your ethnography. There's something that we call the ethnographic present, which if you read the ethnography, it sounds like you're actually there, it's happening in real time. But of course, the time at which you do your research and then publish a book about it, if it becomes a book, because not all ethnographies become books, that could be 5, even 10 years. And so sometimes you're reading about another culture, but you have to realize that it's from the perspective of that culture having been studied back in the day, whenever the person studied it. The narrative structure of your text is key, your readership, and I'll talk a little bit about readership later, and any defining issues or foundations. So if you're writing an ethnography, if you're writing about a culture, even an article, these could be some key issues to think about, in particular how you begin to understand a culture and write about it. As a master's student at the University of Iowa, I took some great classes where we did mini ethnographies. A group of us from one of our ethnography classes went out to a local bar, had some beers, and we just observed people. And we were observing kind of like undergraduate students from sororities and fraternities and kind of some other rituals, if you will, at the bar, which we found a little strange, I guess, as the anthropology students. But it was a cool exercise because we took field notes and then we took that back to our ethnography class and talked about what we observed. Again, to go back to storytelling, we do a lot of storytelling in anthropology. Anything we write is a certain narrative or story. Now, a very important book that came out in the late 80s was written by George Marcus. And he was one of my dissertation advisors at Rice University. And later in the quarter, or maybe this week, I'm forgetting, there is an article I wrote specifically about what's called postmodernism in anthropology for this Anthropology Encyclopedia. And the other thing is the individual pictured here, unfortunately passed away recently, is the late anthropologist Stephen A. Tyler, not Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, often confused. He was my dissertation advisor at Rice, and again, sadly passed away. This was the photo that they chose for the book when he was doing research in a particular culture in India. What was interesting about this book, when Writing Culture came out, it was basically taking this idea of storytelling and saying that when anyone writes about a culture, they're not just being a storyteller, they're not just doing storytelling, but they're often bringing bias and perspective and politics to what they're writing. It was super controversial when it came out in the late 80s, and a lot of anthropologists were horrified with this book. They thought it was taking anthropology and its sacred science of studying cultures and turning it into literary criticism or even an aesthetic kind of approach. And it's been interesting for me to think about this book. And again, I applied to Rice and was accepted and started my work there in 1993, so it was after kind of this period, but it was still very strong when I got there and was a part of all our seminars talking about this book, Writing Culture. You feel at first as a student in a program like that a little shell-shocked because you're among these pretty famous anthropologists, but they were all super supportive and amazing as mentors, and still some of them as mentors today. Still keep in touch with George Marcus, who works at UC Irvine, along with Kim Fortune, who is the chair of the Anthro department at UC Irvine. She was a student just when at Rice I was coming on board. She was leaving, and I had a chance recently to reconnect with Kim and George doing, and also met her husband Mike Fortune here, who was also part of this book, this new edition. And they're all at UC Irvine. I had a chance to do a workshop for one of their visual kind of anthro-focused design classes. So now another stage of this work, I talked about kind of doing the theme space. Another stage was this book, Theme Park. And this was written for a more popular audience, trying to think about just what theme parks are as cultural objects. 6 chapters, not super academic. It was actually translated into Arabic sometime later, so that was kind of cool. My first book that made it into a translation. And this particular book was for a series, as you could see, of key objects of culture: ships, cars, dams, schools, theme parks, aircraft, bathrooms, and so forth. So this is a really cool project, and it was a different press, it was a different approach, and it really allowed me to think about the study of these objects of theming in a much different way. One of the things that happens when you write a book for a popular audience is you get reviews. And so these are reviews, favorable and negative, of this book, Theme Park. But I say that it kind of makes you humble. And here's an example of that. So The Independent, which is a big newspaper in the UK, did a review of this. And I was like, oh, I wonder how it's going to be. And there you go here. So it kind of describes the book. And I underlined the part that isn't necessarily positive. He's not the most vivid of writers, and does not give us a strong flavor of what they're like, more in developing an argument. So it's interesting because when people read books, they say, well, I wanted it to be more about the theme parks themselves, but to try to do that in a relatively short book that has a more global perspective of explaining the object rather than having you feel it makes it kind of tricky. So, but I say this because, believe me, when you get your first one of these, you feel pretty crappy, like, oh man, someone just slammed me. But over time, you get a thick skin, like with anything else. If you're a musician or an artist, you know this as well. And you just kind of learn to take the critiques along with the good comments. I mentioned this, that I did this book with a colleague of mine, John Marmich, who teaches philosophy at the College of Marin, and wanted to really focus on this idea of cultural remaking, on how things are remade, including the focus this week on cultural appropriation. And then I have also done a consultation for the theme park industry. I'll talk about this in a second, with what's called an NDA, or non-disclosure agreement. And this particular workshop I did was actually trying to help a major entertainment company, I can't say the company because of my non-disclosure agreement, develop future properties in gaming, movies, animated movies, attractions, theme parks, and so forth. And this was the spread at this mansion in Southern California that was part of the workshop, which I've never been to a place this fancy. It's like straight out of The Real Wives, one of those shows, The Real Wives of Orange County, or whatever cities they're in. They've never done The Real Wives of Gardnerville, have they? It's always these exclusive cities. Anyway, I digress a little bit, but so another project was later, as I was doing the consultation stuff, this Immersive Worlds Handbook, and I was actually approached to do this kind of blind call, and someone said, would you be interested in doing it? And indeed, I got interested, and it ended up being a very successful project for me, an interesting project. And I wanted to show you that there's a section in here where I talk about culture on page 23. So I might be as guilty of the folks I'm going to be talking about and critiquing a little bit later, of suggesting to folks out there that you can learn about culture for the purposes of specifically creating a theme space. In fact, on page 24, I have a series of culture exercises that people can use to, again, presumably create a theme space. I'm saying presumably because anything that goes into either studying culture or designing a space that purportedly is based on culture, like the Venetian in Las Vegas, which is based on Italy and the city of Venice, there is maybe an assumption that you can get to the heart of what people enjoy about culture and apply it and use that for your space. I did some incredible interviews for this book, including Joel Bergman. He designed all of Steve Wynn's casinos on the Strip, Caesar's Palace, the Mirage, and Treasure Island. So I really got to talk to the luminaries in Las Vegas, in the theme park world. And it was really cool because I got some insights into their design practices. So what I want to show you here is that I'm using my techniques of being an ethnographer, but in a much different sense. I'm interviewing someone. I have to know the questions to ask, and I can tell you hurdles. There was one story doing work for this book. I had an interview with a really big designer for one of the big slot machine companies. There's only a few, but I won't say which one. Anyway, we got the interview, it was done. We talked just about like what slot machines were like and how they were designed and some of the design processes that happen among a design team. And then at the very end, I said, now I need you to sign my release like Joel did and all the others for this book. And they said, well, no, absolutely, we can't sign a release. Absolutely not. And I said, well, why not? You need to just say that you're giving me permission to use it. And they got into all this legalese. I had to strip that from the book. And one of the things that you often don't hear is, you think the research happens, you get everything you want. Just like me getting kicked out of that mall or me getting denied this interview that I spent a lot of time doing and writing the questions for. This will happen to you in your research. So you get frustrated just like those bad reviews of your books or whatever, but you pick yourself up and you say, well, okay, I don't need that interview. I'll do something else. And that's what happened in the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Now, this is from a colleague who teaches design at a school on here in the West. And actually, I'm doing a workshop for him. His students coming up will be using the Immersive Worlds Handbook. And he did these mood boards. And mood boards are specifically ways of capturing a particular feeling of a type of theme. In this case, it's a Western theme and all the various Western spaces, and trying to get a sense of all the moods that you put on this board to capture the design essence. You also have research collaborations. This is a group of German and Canadian and American researchers going to Disneyland and learning about Disney. We were actually all participating together on a panel at the Westin Bonaventure, a pop culture studies panel. And so we went to Disney and we did some on-site in situ research where we talked about things as we were seeing them at Disneyland. Here's an NDA. So an NDA means you do work for a company, you're being paid by that company, and because of your work, you cannot ever talk about it, you can't publish about it, you can't even often put it on your resume. So this is a big media company. You can maybe guess the big media company. They're one of the biggest in the world for sure, very famous. But this is what it looks like. If you sign an NDA, so if you do corporate anthropology and do consultation for Tesla or Google, you might discover that you really want to write about what you studied. I'd love to tell you about these experiences in that mansion in SoCal, but I can't. And the reason for that is trade secrets are highly coveted and protected. If big companies allowed their consultants to describe what they saw, I'm thinking of Edward Snowden when he was a consultant and got all that classified information, it could really lead to some bad situations where competitors get that information and use it for their own purposes because they're in competition with one another. This was my royalty statement. I guess this is my theme for today, talking about how poor you might be writing a book for a particular publishing firm. So this was from the theme park book, and I show this because the year I published this, I wanted to use this photo of a Hitler-themed restaurant in India, and it was from the AP, Associated Press, I think it was, or one of the big photo companies, Getty Images maybe. It was like $300 or $400, so I had to pay for the rights for that. So in that year, I was minus a couple $100 because my net check for that year, I think when the book came out, was $4.46. Now, I should say for writing theme park, I was given a really good advance. So kudos to Reaction. I think it was a $2,000 advance. So you get $2,000 up front. and then over time you start to get royalties from, in this case, 5% of the net sales. So it can be pretty good if you sell hundreds of copies. Now, doing this research in consumer spaces, as I'm getting at, can have its challenges. You think just like you do in traditional ethnography about writing and representation and how to write what you're studying. You use more and more, I would say, a lot of this: imaging, technology, media, recording, blogs, social media, and so forth. And in fact, if you have like a handy field recorder like one of these are really amazing to have in a field situation today, because you can just turn it on, get all your notes, you can pop the SD card out and have all that information. When I was doing research in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of this. There were I had this old 4-track recorder, which I really couldn't carry into field settings. Nowadays, you have a phone too. So think about this. If you're doing research either in consumer space or any ethnographic research, really think about using the technology and leveraging it. Again, I showed you a little bit of my photo galleries. I'm constantly taking my images and video and I'm creating, this is in Final Cut Pro, creating video versions of those and then putting that on my YouTube site. In this case, I'm actually talking about doing research and taking photography in Las Vegas. I think this was the Aria. Stayed in a really nice suite at the Aria, and I'm just talking about my research and photography using mobile apps, using social media, and also the research presentation. One of the reasons I have the particular website that I do is to be able to show people the nature of my research. So I can easily take a video at the New York, title it something. This is a really short video, and then put it up on my YouTube site and share it with the world. And it's sometimes a better way to do research, because I feel like a lot of people are maybe afraid of reading academic journals, and as a result, it makes it a little bit more accessible for a wider audience. This is a bit about research methods, and I'll try to remember to post some of these to our site just as handouts. I use this in most of my classes, my Soc and Anthro, to describe types of research that we do. So this talks about the difference between social science and more lab-based research that you might be doing, kind of on this side. And it also gets into some of the issues like NDAs, human subject reviews, ethics, as we'll talk about in the next few weeks. So important information to know. I'll try to link that. Now, ethics and research, definitely check out, starting on page 38, the section in the text that discusses ethics. It's one of the keys to cultural anthropology, because we realize that if we have a situation where someone is put into a very bad circumstance or bad light, and they live in a totalitarian country, or they possibly, are working somewhere and you reveal something they said about their boss, that can be very negative for that person. And this describes just some of the scenarios to think about and fieldwork settings. And the main bit is right here on 38, ethical issues in truth-telling. So just be sure to read this over. The Nuremberg Code, the American Anthropological Association Code, you can click on these. This is the code of ethics: don't harm, be honest, obtain consent, etc. One of the things I did when I first started writing my dissertation, and I wrote an article for a book that my advisor George Marcus wrote, and it was about the theme park, Astroworld. It was still open, it was fresh, like people were still there, and I didn't feel comfortable naming the theme park, so I didn't. I also didn't feel comfortable naming people. So I had a sheet in my notebook of names of people. I did this in my dissertation too. So if someone's name was Sue, I might have changed it to Emily. I had almost like a coding sheet to change the names of people. Very important to do, because you do need to think about the ethical side of research and protecting, if it's applicable, the anonymity of what we call your informants in the field. Now, the book talks about this book, Darkness in El Dorado by Patrick Tierney, and I won't give you the long story of this, but basically it was an accusation of genocide and terrible situations committed by James Neal, a geneticist, and Napoleon Chagnon, who was formerly at UC Santa Barbara. And I knew some folks years ago in that program, and they said that when this book came out, it came out in 2000, that Chagnon was really, it devastated him in terms of the accusations. And I'll let you read into this a little bit more. It's described in our text. But if you want more information, you can go online and read more about the accusations. The AAA did an extensive analysis of the accusations and didn't find wrongdoing. They found concerns with the research, but it's one of those scandals that when it hit Anthropology, I think a lot of people were really concerned about it having kind of a blowback on the field and a negative sort of portrayal of what anthropologists do. Now, if you get a chance, go to the additional readings. I include this short piece on culture shock. I think culture shock is a great opportunity to think about the nuances of culture this week, so I definitely recommend going to the week 2 module, click on the additional reading, and click on this little piece here, the 4 stages of culture shock. The one thing I'll say is that anthropologists, unlike, say, tourists, often see culture shock as insights about a culture. So you go to another place, you experience their food or their customs, and it negatively affects you. You don't like that. As a result, you kind of have this negative, even psychological or physical response. I mentioned in last week's lecture that, like when I was teaching in London and I didn't drive for a while, coming back home, I had reverse culture shock, meaning that I wasn't used to being in a car and I kind of hated getting behind the wheel again because I got so used to living in London to walking down a couple doors down from my apartment to the local, baguette shop and getting a baguette, or going to the grocery a couple blocks beyond that. So, culture shock, I think, is something really interesting for us to maybe talk about this week, particularly as we do our discussion posts. I mentioned the work of Grant McCracken. He wrote a book called Culturematic, and it was this idea of looking at everything from Burning Man to Julia Child, reality TV, NFL films, even blog sites like this woman who did her face, pictures of her face over the course of a year, and writing about the idea that, as he says, a culturematic is a little bit of culture. It's an attitude of mind that goes beyond the box of ordinary thinking, not because it is mischievous to do so, but because there might be a world out there. It might be interesting to find out what this world is. So you could literally think of anything in the world, particularly via social media, and use that as a little experiment, a little bit of culture to sort of test the boundaries of culture and maybe introduce a new sort of trend or tendency in the world. Now, I find McCracken's work really interesting. I do question, though, in these uses of culture, when they get used in some of these corporate ways, including in my own work, are we meaning the same thing as when anthropologists are talking about culture in an academic sense? So you might think about that this week. Now, Clotaire Rapaille, a famous French consultant who's worked for numerous corporations, suggested this idea of using culture and studying it for the purposes of branding and marketing. And I won't tell you the long story, but I know that there was some controversy related to his work. You can look that up. But the Culture Code, I think, is an interesting book that suggests this idea that you can learn about the key essence, to go back to Ruth Benedict's work during World War II, learn the key essence of how Americans think in terms of food, let's say, and diet. And then say, okay, I'm going to market to that because I figured out that culture code for eating. Well, unfortunately, again, getting back to ethics, in the case of American diet, what if you discover that people like really crappy food and fast food and food that's disgusting and bad for them, but you decide to market to that tendency? Not everything in culture is good necessarily. We often talk about things that are dysfunctional in our culture. In American society and American culture, we'd certainly talk about consumerism as part of this conversation about the bad sides of our society and our culture. So as you think about this week, I would really encourage you to say, is this ethical? Is what Rapaille and McCracken are doing ethical? Is my work ethical? Is it ethical for me to work with big media companies to take my ideas from the Immersive Worlds Handbook and then say okay, I'm going to help them design? Because what happened in this workshop is a few anthropologists were brought in, and we were brought in to do culture for these media corporations. You tell us, you're the anthropologist, how would you tell us to create this property or this entity or this thing or this game or this toy based on how we can use culture as a means of better marketing to people who will visit the places we design or buy the toys that we create or the video games that we create. So this stage is not without some level of precarity or danger, because I feel like the possibility here is to sort of do the wrong thing, to possibly get involved in something that maybe has a negative outcome for for society, and maybe that sounds kind of ominous. Going back, but in any case, think about these issues this week. Going back to the book, check out page 31 in the textbook, and in particular, they talk about this idea of the other. The other, using Gulliver's Travels as an example, is sort of a person different from us, and sometimes we feel ethnocentric towards the other. It's something we try to combat by using the deep understanding of cultural relativism, as we've talked about. Now, culture in anthropology is like physics, or is like gravity in the discipline of physics. It's foundational, but a lot of us would question, does it really exist? When we talk about it, and I mentioned the culture light version, it's sort of suggesting like it exists, but it may not be as powerful as we once assumed it to be. In particular, if we talk about various subcultures in the world, including groups like those in the world of Tiki, and if you get a chance, check out the additional reading and click on my work on the cultures of Tiki, where I studied Tiki subcultures in Southern California. And also, this woman, Sarah Burke, wrote an article called Abolish the Tiki Bar, and she quoted my work, so I thought it was interesting to include. So the question becomes, if we exist in subcultures, whether those are subcultures of Tiki or punk or straight edge or whatever, does that negate this idea of culture having meaning at this macro level, the big level of our world? Or does it suggest that we have particular interests and characteristics, but we're still part of that big thing we call culture? So think about that this week. As we get into cultural appropriation, check out the additional readings. There's a slew, and check out the additional media. So basically, cultural appropriation is taking something. It could be like Miley Cyrus, who is white, appropriating and wearing dreadlocks. Is that offensive? Is it showing disrespect for another culture? Kind of up for us to debate this, and I'd really like this to be the subject of our debate this week, because I'm particularly fascinated in the idea of cultural appropriation. You can check out my unpublished paper, Culture Sampling, where I try to suggest this idea, somewhat drawing on theme parks and world expos, and here's maybe my favorite photo in all of Las Vegas, the warning sign before you go into the Paris, warning you that it's an accurate recreation of an authentic street. It's like you need a warning because it's so authentic, you might trip on it. And it is indeed kind of a cobblestone street, but this kind of says something, I think, about what we're getting into in culture sampling. So I begin with the World Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, very famous for recreating many nations, 40 different nations. And I use this as the idea of saying, just like a DJ samples, say the amen break, a famous drum break, which is like the most famous drum break in the world, and puts that in their music, what folks who design spaces often are doing is sampling from other cultures and using these samples as stand-ins or references to the bigger thing. So you go to the Venetian or the Paris in Las Vegas, you get the little bits of the bridge, the Rialto Bridge, and other places, and the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and then that's sort of like a stand-in for the whole, for the city, or even in some cases for the entire country. So you can check out my piece on culture sampling and some of the examples I give, and talk about the tendencies, including some of the stuff connected to DJing and technology, which is kind of my other life of music and technology. So those two worlds are some way coming together. Check out the additional media. I showed you that on our site. And hopefully you'll have a chance just to engage with some of this material. And again, what I really recommend is, as you find something that's fascinating, whether it's from the additional reading or the additional media, you can always incorporate that as part of your discussion post for the week. A lot of opportunities to think through different issues. So for this week, we'll talk about aspects of research, aspects of culture, and then as our special topic or issue, cultural appropriation. I think the fourth one that we might talk about this week that is connected to the concept of culture is the work of folks like McCracken, Rapai, or myself doing consultation for entertainment and consumer companies, taking the idea of culture and applying it to creating a space for you, selling you something, branding something, creating a marketing opportunity. Is that ethical? Is that not ethical? And then lastly, I think if any of you want to do research in the future in pop culture or in any space, think about some of the technologies or things available like recorders or phones, because they allow you to do some amazing work in the world that certainly weren't available, these technologies, when I was doing stuff back in the ice age of the 1990s. So that's going to be it for week 2. So good luck with this week. Again, kind of keep on track with all the readings. Make sure you do all your assignments, check your due dates and all that kind of stuff. And then next week, I'll be back with a week 3 lecture getting into more issues as we move through the quarter. So thanks for listening. I'll see you back here in week 3 lecture.